我宣布
The 10,158th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Adam Usunu, Director, Crisis Response Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Ms. Vanessa Fraser, Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Children and Armed Conflict. And Mr. Ted Chaiban, Deputy Executive Director, United Nations Children's Fund. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Adam Usunu.
Mr. President, Excellencies, since we briefed this Council on Tuesday, more civilians have been killed. We are here because of reports of an attack on a college dormitory housing minors and students in Starobliesk in the Luhansk region. This attack reportedly caused scores of civilian casualties, including children. The situation is still unfolding, and there is much we do not yet know. But what we do know is that the human cost of this war reveals a pattern that defies international humanitarian law. Civilians must be protected. Mr. President, the toll of this war on civilians is staggering, still rising. The statistics bear repeating. Since February of 2022, the United Nations has recorded nearly 16,000 civilians killed and more than 44,000 injured. The real numbers are most certainly much higher. Mr. President, on Tuesday, I briefed this Council on the toll of this armed conflict on humanitarian workers and their assets. It is deeply troubling that I must report more death and destruction. A ballistic missile struck a UNHCR contracted warehouse in Dnipro on the night of 19 to 20 May, killing 2 warehouse workers and destroying more than $1 million worth of aid, including blankets and hygiene kits intended for evacuees and people sheltering in collective sites. This is the 5th hit on humanitarian workers and assets in just 9 days. Excellencies, Mr. President, this must stop. The obligation to protect civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian workers and their assets, is binding on all parties to this conflict. Directing attacks against civilians and indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited under international law. All feasible precautions must be taken to avoid and minimize civilian harm. These obligations do not change depending on the tactics and the weaponry, whether long-range missiles or the cheap short-range drones that are now killing more civilians than any other weapon in this war. Mr. President, protecting civilians also means allowing them to voluntarily leave to safer areas and ensuring they have the essential services to survive. I reiterate OCHA's willingness to work with all parties to support safe, voluntary, dignified evacuations and to ensure sustained humanitarian access to frontline communities on both sides of the line. Excellencies, Mr. President, my asks to this Council are not new. Please use your influence to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and that there is accountability when it is violated. Protect civilians, including children, wherever they are. Ensure rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need across all areas of Ukraine, including those under the control of the Russian Federation. This requires the active engagement of all parties. Civilians enduring these attacks need more than statements of concern. They need concrete action that protects them from death and injury and ensures humanitarian assistance continues to reach them wherever they are and when they need it most. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Usunu for her briefing, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Vanessa Fraser.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have been following with concern reports from the Luhansk region of Ukraine under temporary occupation by the Russian Federation that an attack overnight on a vocational school and its dormitory in the town of Starobilsk has killed and injured several people, including children. Several individuals may still be trapped beneath the rubble. The United Nations does not have access to the area and is not in a position to confirm details of the reported attack. As we have heard earlier this week in this same room, more than 4 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, large-scale attacks continue daily in Ukraine, causing civilian and child casualties and damaging critical civilian infrastructure. Reported Ukrainian strikes inside the Russian Federation have also resulted in civilian casualties and damage to residential buildings and other civilian objects. I strongly condemn all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. As the Secretary-General has repeatedly underscored, such attacks are prohibited under international law and must end immediately. Civilians, children, humanitarian personnel, and civilian objects, including schools and hospitals, must never be targeted. The protection of children must remain paramount. Their homes, their classrooms, and their futures cannot be treated as collateral damage. I also urge all concerned parties to refrain from any actions to put children in harm's way and which would further escalate the already dangerous situation. The reported incident in Starobilsk is a stark reminder of a broader and deeply troubling pattern. Attacks on schools continue to disrupt the education of millions of boys and girls in conflict-affected regions worldwide. When schools are damaged or destroyed, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate loss of infrastructure, sometimes of life too. Children lose not only their classrooms, but also their sense of safety, stability, their routine, and their hope and dreams of their future. This has devastating and lifelong impacts. Schools must remain safe havens, places where learning, growth, and dignity are protected. Education is not only a human right, it is a lifeline. I recently traveled to Ukraine and to the Russian Federation and visited locations impacted by the conflict in both countries. In Ukraine, I visited an underground metro school in the city of Kharkiv, where I spoke with school children who continue learning even under constant air alerts. I have also visited several sites impacted by the conflict. In Ukraine, the impact of the war on education is tragic, and children's access to education and other essential services has been disrupted on a massive scale. According to UN-verified information, over 440 attacks on schools were verified in Ukraine during 2025, making it one of the situations on the Children and Armed Conflict agenda most affected by this grave violation. During my visit to the city of Belgorod in the Russian Federation, I also visited schools and spoke to students and saw firsthand how children have been affected by conflict and visited sites also impacted by this war. Across all conflict-affected regions, from the testimonies I have personally received in different situations I visited in the last months, children and their families and their communities all share the same message. Stop harming children. Put their protection first. Protect their schools. Do not compromise their education, their development, and their future. We must act with urgency and determination. Prove that children affected by conflict matter. Protected schools and education facilities is not an optional. It is a legal and moral imperative. In conclusion, I reiterate the Secretary-General's call for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as a step towards a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law and UN resolutions. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Fraser for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ted Chaiban.
Mr. President, thank you for inviting UNICEF to speak today. The need for this discussion could not be more urgent. The war in Ukraine continues to rage and devastate children's lives. According to reports, last night drone strikes hit a dormitory housing at least 86 adolescents aged 14 to 18 in the town of Starobilsk in the Luhansk region. The attack reportedly left 6 dead and dozens of others injured, including children. It is too early to know the full extent of the casualties, as we understand rescue operations are still unfolding. This is yet another example of children paying the price for a war that is not of their own making. According to verified UN data, more than 3,400 children have now been killed or injured since the escalation of the war in 2022. Furthermore, millions of children in Ukraine continue to be affected by the unrelenting hostilities, including by living under air raids with risk of aerial attacks, displacement, and heightened uncertainty and fear that nowhere is safe, even when they go to sleep at night. UNICEF reiterates the urgency for all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and ensure civilians, including children, are protected from attack. We remain concerned at the continued use of explosive weapons in populated areas with technology such as armed drones exposing children to much suffering and traumatic events. In addition, the essential services that children, adolescents, and young people rely on for their survival and well-being continue to come under attack, including homes, schools, health facilities, energy, and water and sanitation systems. We remain particularly concerned about attacks on schools and the devastating effect it is having on students, teachers, and learning. More than 1,780 educational facilities have been verified as damaged or destroyed since 2022. This impacts access to learning today and disrupts education for the years to come. During more than 4 years of war, children have also been forced to flee their homes on multiple occasions. More than a third of Ukraine's children, 2.6 million, remain displaced, including more than 791,000 children inside Ukraine and nearly 1.8 million children outside the country. According to a recent UNICEF survey, 1 in 3 adolescents aged 15 to 19 reported moving at least twice, citing safety as the most common reason for fleeing. Seeking better access to education and other social services was also noted as being a key driver of displacement. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the constant fear of attacks, endless sheltering in basements, and isolation at home with limited social connections mean children and young people are exhausted. They need support to recover years of lost educational opportunities, lost social engagement, and to heal from unspeakable damage to their mental health and well-being. There has been an alarming increase in mental health challenges faced by children and adolescents in Ukraine. A UNICEF survey in 2025 revealed that almost 1/3 of teenagers report feeling so bad or hopeless that it stopped them from doing their usual activities, with girls particularly affected. I would like to close with 3 asks to this Council. Firstly, there needs to be renewed commitment to ensure parties to the conflict abide by their obligations to protect children in line with international humanitarian and human rights law. Children continue to be killed and injured by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and this needs to stop. Secondly, we would echo the call for safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access across Ukraine, including territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. As a neutral and impartial humanitarian actor, UNICEF remains committed to providing humanitarian assistance and protection to all children in need. And lastly, we need the unanimous support of this Council and member states to use all of their leverage to facilitate a political dialogue that can help put an end to this war and provide hope for millions of children for a lasting peace. Thank you.
感谢。
I thank Mr. Chaiban for his briefing. And I'll give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, on the 19th of May, at the request of Ukraine and its group of Western supporters, a meeting of the Security Council was held on Ukraine. During that meeting, the permanent representative Melnik, who enjoys flaunting his knowledge of Russian aphorisms and quotes, assured those present in the chamber that, I quote, "Unlike Russia, Ukrainians' armed forces never target civilians. We only destroy military assets in full compliance with international humanitarian law. And we reject all the fairy tales that we have just heard." End of quote. He referred to the statement delivered by the Russian representative with crocodile tears by the representative of Russia, who once again seeks to squeeze sympathy and compassion out of this chamber. Waxing poetic on his favored theme, he talked about the destruction of Russia's economy, its inevitable collapse, as well as the eminent successes of the Ukrainian army and the defeat of Moscow that would be imminent. And in connection with this, I wish to invite Mr. Melnikov to the Russian Federation. I think that we can provide for his security there and safety so that he can see firsthand how the Russian economy is writhing. And not just in Moscow, but also in the provinces. I fear, however, that the Ukrainian permanent representative will be prevented from doing so due to his wishful thinking. I also wish to ask Pan Melnik if the Ukrainian armed forces achieved such unbelievable successes in the fight against the aggressor, why then does the Kiev clique continuously drone on and on about the immediate and unconditional ceasefire? These desperate appeals are somewhat at odds with your assessment of the situation on the battlefield. Incidentally, these are all rhetorical questions to which we will not hear any responses. The Ukrainian permanent representative has been speaking at the Security Council as a mouthpiece of the Kiev propaganda machine, attempting to awe impressionable Europeans with his rousing speeches, so God forbid they not have any doubts about the need to continue to provide support for the Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Mr. President, today we have convened an Emergency Security Council meeting in connection with the horrific terrorist attack perpetrated by the neo-Nazi Kiev regime targeting Russian civilians. On the evening of 22 May, the Ukrainian armed formation using 4 uncrewed lethal aerial devices deliberately targeted an administrative building and dormitory in the Starobelsk College of the Lugansk State Pedagogical University. When this occurred in the dormitory, according to existing reports, there were 86 students aged 14 to 18 and 1 worker. As a result, the 5-story building was destroyed to the 2nd floor. As of 3 o'clock, it has been confirmed that 6 people died. More than 40 children were wounded to varying degrees of severity. Unfortunately, this figure is liable to increase. A number of children continue to remain in critical condition in hospital, and the search for missing persons is ongoing. Children are still buried under the rubble. Furthermore, in Starobelsk, there have administrative buildings have also been destroyed and affected, including stores and private homes. And in one of them, a man has been wounded. The Russian Investigative Committee has initiated a criminal case. I will not overburden members of the Security Council with photographs from the area where this took place. For example, this one. We requested the Chinese presidency to circulate among the membership of the Security Council these photographs from where the incident took place. This constitutes a deliberate strike targeting a civilian object where children live and study, carried out at nighttime when the dormitory was full, and it was clearly perpetrated with the aim of incurring the highest possible number of casualties. Under international humanitarian law, this constitutes a war crime. The strike could not have been accidental. 3 waves of drones struck the same area. The drone strike targeting the college could not have been the result of the work of air defense systems nor radio electronic warfare, as was immediately alleged by Kiev. No person who was in the building in the area could have in any way participated in military activity, and there were no military objects in the vicinity of the college. This attack targeting sleeping children is the latest piece of evidence about the craven terroristic nature of the anti-humane substance of the Kiev authorities, who are sustaining battlefield losses, and in their agonies they are perpetrating attacks against that which is sacred. And the West is turning a blind eye to these crimes. Furthermore, this clearly attests to the perfidiousness and the bad faith position of Kiev, who, with the egging on of Western sponsors, not only has no intention to embrace a peaceful resolution, but they are also openly sabotaging this. Such strikes using long-range weapons provided to the Kiev regime by NATO countries, including drones, are being carried out with technical assistance being provided by foreign specialists from well-known NATO states. We have credible information about Western capitals providing the Ukrainian armed forces with intelligence information and providing assistance in terms of targeting. Mr. President, today, yet again, we probably will hear a great deal of hypocritical comments to the, for example, about us not being here today had the Russian Federation not unleashed an aggressive war. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a blatant lie, the purpose of which is to deliberately, I underscore this, deliberately to mislead everybody seated in this chamber. Had the Russian Federation not begun the special military operation, such tragedies as what transpired in Starobilsk would have taken place every single day. Moreover, for a long 8 years up until 2022, such deliberate strikes targeting civilian residents in Donbass were conducted on a virtually daily basis. The media outlets, which are completely under the control of Western sponsors, were utterly disregarding and ignoring these countless instances of human casualties taking place. The Russian and Russian language residents were mercilessly persecuted and prosecuted. Then they were viewed as second-class citizens. Such so-called leaders in the Western world did everything possible for their societies be left in the dark about the atrocities perpetrated by the Ukrainian radicals who seized power. There were significant attempts undertaken to create an idyllic picture of the new democratic authorities, thanks to whom a revolution of dignity took place, and allegedly the Ukrainian people, who allegedly were oppressed by Yanukovych, finally achieved a long anticipated freedom. The truth lies in the fact that this was no revolution of dignity at all. This was an anti-constitutional coup fueled from abroad, during which a legitimately elected president was ousted. You will never hear from Western self-proclaimed beacons of democracy about the truth of what took place in Ukraine for all this time, beginning in 2014, and what is continuing to take place to this date. They remain silent about the fact that the post-Maidan clique is violently forcing and pushing through all-out anti-humane and inhumane nationalism, which is alien to the majority of the residents of Ukraine. We see the continuous glorification of those who, during the Second World War, with the Nazis, brutally exterminated hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians. And along the same lines, we saw the full and complete tacit silence of the Europeans when the Hitlerite Nazi Andrei Melnik was exhumed in Luxembourg and heinously reburied in the center of Kiev. We continue to see reprisals targeting any dissent, and opposition has been languishing in torture chambers. Men of enlistment age, including those who are unfit for service, are rounded up in broad daylight in the streets of Kiev, Kharkov, Odessa, and many other cities, and subsequently they are either maimed and murdered, or they are sent to the front, being forced to fight for the corrupt people and their sponsors who have entrenched themselves on Bancovaya. These egregious instances, thousands of such instances, are frequently mentioned by us both during Security Council meetings and during informal ARIA formula meetings. And what is the response to all of this from Western champions of human rights? The response is very simple. They do not react. They continue to look at everything just a teeny tiny bit, and either they remain silent, which reflects approval, or they applaud, or they're terrorists under their control. Furthermore, they hypocritically deny their complicity in the Ukrainian crisis, and thereby fueling the neo-Nazi regime's crimes in Kiev. Mr. President, the Kiev neo-Nazi regime never ceased its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in our country, using cruise missiles and long-range multi-rocket artillery of the Western countries. In Bancovaya, there are open cries of joy when women, children, and the elderly are killed, when there are strikes targeting residential homes and social facilities. In April alone, as a result of the criminal acts of the Ukrainian fighters, at least 100 civilians were killed, including 8 children. 667 people, including 34 minors, were injured. Over the past week, as a result of the continuous strikes and drone attacks by the Ukrainian Nazis, 234 civilians, Russian civilians, were affected. Of them, 203 were injured, including 18 children. 31 people were killed, including 2 children. The deaths of people is always a tragedy. And this is why we are all the more bewildered at the cynical nature of the comments delivered by certain European colleagues who clearly divide civilians into those whose murders they condemn and those whose extermination they ignore or perfidiously call this legitimate, with references to Kiev's right to self-defense. This is a deliberate murder of minors, and this took place against the backdrop of the mendacious lamentations of Kiev about the plight of children affected during military hostilities. The whole world is bearing witness to how cynical the Zelensky regime is when they make children objects of terror. Once again, it behooves us to note that members of the Security Council, Western members, who trot out insinuations about the alleged 20,000 Ukrainian children abducted by the Russian Federation, they remain silent about the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces targeting Russian children, deeming them unworthy of protection. Similar appalling double standards were demonstrated by them regarding the Iranian school children who died as a result of the U.S. strike in late February in Minab, as well as the strike in Gaza, the strikes in Gaza, which have transformed the Strip into a children's graveyard. A number of countries seated at this table are the main providers and suppliers of weapons to the Zelensky regime, and they are not even concealing the fact that they view this as their right. You need to understand that in this way you are justifying and you are complicit in terrorist attacks such as that which took place last night, and accountability for these crimes will be inevitable. We call upon international structures, national governments, and the international community to provide a frank assessment of the crimes of the Zelensky regime and to strongly condemn the brutal terrorist attack in Starobelsk. Silence will be tantamount to complicity in the brutal actions of the Kiev terrorists and indifference to the plight of innocent, dead, and wounded children. To summarize, we began this special military operation in order to end the bloodletting and the lawlessness of the regime in the neighboring country, and rest assured that we will achieve these objectives. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
I would like to thank OCHA Director Gosournou, that the SRSG Fraser for Children and Armed Conflict, and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Chaiban for their briefings. Mr. President, Greece has been unequivocal on the need to end Russia's war on aggression and has been supportive of peace efforts to that end. Yet, the bloodshed continues, with civilians suffering the consequences. The time for a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire is long overdue. The reported attack against a college dormitory in the temporarily occupied territory of Luhansk is another stark reminder of the need to end this war. We call on Russia to allow access to the relevant UN agencies in order to verify and report to the international community. We recall that in blatant violation of international humanitarian law, this war has claimed the lives of almost 16,000 civilians in Ukraine, injuring more than 44,000. These numbers are growing by the day. Protection of civilians in armed conflict is non-negotiable. Compliance with international humanitarian law is not optional. IHL strictly prohibits the targeting of civilians, mandates the humane treatment of detained, and safeguards civilian infrastructure. Protection of children is also non-negotiable. In the course of this war, almost 800 Ukrainian children have been killed, almost 2,800 have been injured, and thousands more have been deported and forcibly transferred to Russia. Mr. President, the UN membership has repeatedly been vocal through multiple General Assembly resolutions on the need for an immediate ceasefire. The same applies for the vast majority of this Council. In this spirit, recent threats against Latvia are neither helpful nor conducive to a peaceful settlement. Greece expresses its full solidarity to Latvia as a fellow EU and NATO member state. Under no circumstances should the spillover of the military operations in the wider region be allowed. Once more, Greece condemns in the strongest terms any deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, and calls for the unconditional and full respect of international humanitarian law, which includes measures to protect civilians from harm. We also stress the need to end and prevent all violations and abuses against children. Once more, Greece calls for the silencing of guns, the resumption of dialogue and diplomacy, and a good faith negotiation towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace that will be in line with the international law, the UN Charter, and will fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank Director Gosurnu, SRSG Frazier, and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Shaiban for their briefings. Ever since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, civilians, including children, and civilian infrastructure have been disproportionately affected by the attacks. We are deeply perturbed by the escalation in fighting lately and the consequential worsening humanitarian impact. As we have stated in the past, such actions further fuel the conflict, deepen distrust, and undermine any meaningful efforts for peace. Pakistan's principled position on matters related to international law, including international humanitarian law, has been clear and consistent. Civilian and non-combatants must not become objects of attacks in situations of armed conflict anywhere. And protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental legal obligation under IHL, which must be fully and consistently upheld by all parties and under all circumstances. President, what is earnestly required is to invest in concerted efforts to bring this protracted conflict to an early end. Military means cannot bring lasting peace. Only a resolute commitment to dialogue a complete cessation of hostilities, and necessary political will can bring about enduring peace. From the outset, Pakistan has favored and advocated dialogue and diplomacy for peaceful settlement of this conflict. Bringing lasting peace would require commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution that corresponds to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements. In this context, we reiterate our hope that the parties would resume the US-facilitated dialogue process at the earliest. Pakistan will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. Any further delay in reaching a mutually agreeable settlement will only add to the suffering and agony of the affected populations. A tragic outcome it would be, but that could be very well avoided if there is a ceasefire in place and if the parties were to return to the dialogue table. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, and we thank Director Vosorno, SRC Fraser, and Deputy Executive Director Shaban for their briefings. Mr. President, it is difficult to comment on the alleged claims made in this chamber by the Russian Federation until they have been independently verified. Unlike in Ukraine, there is no free media in Russia and the occupied territories, nor unfettered access for credible, independent journalists or international humanitarian organizations. We note that the alleged incident happened in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine and thus call for an independent investigation. Access must be granted by Russia. Throughout this war, Denmark has consistently deplored attacks on civilians and demanded full respect of international humanitarian law without exceptions. There must be full accountability and justice for all crimes committed in this senseless war of choice launched by Russia. In this respect, we note that Ukraine is a party to the Rome Statute and has been fully cooperating with the International Criminal Court's investigations into war crimes. The same cannot be said about Russia. Mr. President, let us recall the facts. Russia invaded its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, already in 2014 and then launched a massive full-scale invasion in 2022. The UN has verified that this attempt to change internationally recognized borders by force in violation of the UN Charter has so far killed and wounded over 60,000 Ukrainian civilians. And that figure includes almost 800 Ukrainian children killed and more than 2,715 children injured in Russian attacks. Not to speak of thousands more left without parents, or the millions who've spent 4 years with massively disrupted schooling, spending countless nights in bomb shelters in fear of their lives, forced to flee their homes. Or in the temporarily occupied territories, the numerous and not forgotten Ukrainian children forced to deny their language and culture and attend Russian re-education camps, or the thousands who were abducted and transported to Russia in the immediate aftermath after the full-scale invasion, an unforgivable war crime resulting in an international arrest warrant against President Putin. Mr. President, let me also point to the fact that only a few days ago, Russia openly threatened to attack another peaceful neighbor, Latvia, in this very chamber. We reject these unacceptable statements, which we strongly condemn. Denmark stands firmly by our NATO allies and our EU partners against any threats. If we were to apply the same logic behind Russia's call for today's meeting, we would need twice daily Emergency Security Council meetings, including on the weekends, to only scratch the surface of the terror, death, and destruction inflicted across Ukraine by Russia. This only serves to remind us all that a full ceasefire, which Ukraine has offered Russia for over 1 year, cannot wait. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is time for Russia's leaders to accept a ceasefire and finally engage in a serious good faith peace talks directly with Ukraine and secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, I would like at the outset to thank Ms. Adam Wasurno, Director of the Crisis Response Division at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Vanessa Fraser, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, and Mr. Ted Chaiban, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, for their briefings and valuable insights. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its deep concern over the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine and its escalation in recent years. We also express concern over the grave humanitarian consequences for civilians, including children, a situation that highlights the urgent need to end this war. In this regard, I would like to highlight the following points. First, the Kingdom of Bahrain stresses the utmost importance of all parties to the conflict to avoid the targeting of civilians, civilian objects, and critical infrastructure, and the need for the parties to respect the provisions of international humanitarian law at all times. Attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure continue to increase, resulting in loss of life and worsening humanitarian and living conditions. This threatens security and stability and undermines international efforts aimed at achieving comprehensive and sustainable peace in Europe and maintaining international peace and security. Second, the Kingdom of Bahrain had previously warned a few days ago in this Council, and today we reiterate this warning about the growing and concerning use of drones in conflicts. This contributes to increasing instability, the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, and poses a long-term threat to international peace and security. Such incidents have been repeatedly observed this year. Third, the Kingdom of Bahrain reiterates its welcoming of the United Nations Secretary General's call for a comprehensive, immediate, unconditional, and lasting ceasefire as a fundamental step toward achieving a just and sustainable peace. Bahrain also encourages temporary truce initiatives, including those proposed by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, which are hoped These truces, these initiatives are hoped to translate into tangible results on the ground and lead to long-term peace. Fourth, the Kingdom of Bahrain emphasizes the need to intensify diplomatic efforts toward achieving lasting peace that ensures the return to normal life for civilians, including children, allowing them to return to their schools and continue their education safely and without fear or danger, just like children everywhere in the world, free from the effects and the suffering of war. In this context, the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its appreciation for the efforts of the United Arab Emirates, which have led to the release of 7,101 detainees from both sides since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. It also commends the efforts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in facilitating the release of detainees and prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the continued humanitarian mediation efforts of the State of Qatar to reunite children with their families. We also commend the efforts of the President of the U.S. in political mediation and temporary ceasefires. The Kingdom of Bahrain calls for the continuation of such positive and constructive humanitarian efforts which help support de-escalation, reduce tensions, and enhance opportunities for reaching a peaceful resolution to the Ukrainian crisis, as well as play an important role in building trust between the parties concerned. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reiterates its support for a just, sustainable and comprehensive solution that will end this destructive war and restore security and stability in Europe in line with the principles of the UN Charter, international law and relevant UN resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. Now I give the floor to Liberia.
We join in thanking the briefers and welcomes the participation of the distinguished permanent representative of Ukraine. On Wednesday this week, Liberia reminded this council that international humanitarian law exists to place a shield between civilians and the violence of war. Yet, while we in this chamber awoke in safety this morning, we are reconvened this afternoon on claims by a respected member that overnight an attack is said to have struck an academic building and dormitory in Starobilsk, killing and injuring civilians, including children. If confirmed, this will constitute a grave violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Liberia unequivocally condemns any attack directed against civilians or civilian objects, whoever the perpetrator and wherever such acts occur. The principle of distinction is fundamental and non-negotiable. No asserted military advantage can justify the targeting of a dormitory where students are asleep. Let us be clear. Schools are not battlefields, and children must never be targets. Liberia reaffirms its strong support for the Safe Schools Declaration and calls on all parties to honor their commitments to protect students, educators, and educational facilities. Ultimately, we renew our calls for an end to the war and for enhanced diplomatic efforts to achieve a lasting, peaceful solution. In this regard, we wish to call on the Council to demand full compliance by all parties with international humanitarian law, particularly with respect to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We also call for guaranteeing safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to affected populations. And we call on this Council to reaffirm with one clear and unified voice that attacks on schools and educational facilities are truly unacceptable and unjustifiable. Liberia urges this Council, Mr. President, to act not in service of competing narratives, but in defense of civilians, in preservation of international law, and above all, for the protection of children. At a minimum, we owe every child the basic assurance that the places where they learn and rest will never be overtaken by war. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to first and foremost thank Madam Edem Wasorno, Director, Crisis Response Division of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Madam Vanessa Frazier, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, and Mr. Ted Chaiban, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, for their briefings which shed light on reports which are as yet incomplete about the events which appear to have occurred in Lugansk Oblast on Ukrainian territory, which is occupied by the Russian Federation. I stress Ukrainian territory, which is illegally occupied by the Russian Federation. Russian authorities have asserted that at least 4 children were killed, 4 were wounded in a presumed strike by the Ukrainian army on the college in Starobilsk, Lugansk Oblast, in Ukrainian territory, which is illegally occupied by the Russian Federation. The deaths of innocent children are always unacceptable. Full light needs to be shed on what transpired in an independent manner. France has consistently called for respect for international humanitarian law. These principles, particularly those of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, must apply under all circumstances. Civilian populations must always be protected. The Russian Federation has been illegally occupying since 2014 part of Ukrainian territory, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, and now 4 years ago, it has now been 4 years since the Russian Federation unleashed a war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia called for this emergency meeting of the Security Council, has been on a daily basis bombarding major Ukrainian cities with utter disregard for civilian lives. Russia has sought to break the resistance of the Ukrainian population, stripping people of access to electricity and heat during glacial winters. Russia has allowed for the torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians in its jails. A number of United Nations reports attest to this. 3 days ago, in this chamber, the Russian Federation threatened Latvia, a member of the Security Council, a member of the European Union, a member of NATO, threatened Latvia with carrying out strikes on its decision-making centers. France is wedded to our alliances. We affirm our solidarity and support with Latvia. We reject this escalation, which is both unacceptable and utterly reckless. Russia has refused to allow for the extension of the ceasefire after the 9 May celebrations, and this after having done the same with the Orthodox Easter truce in April. It is past time to bring this war to an end. Russia must heed the message that was addressed to it by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the overwhelming majority of member states, message about the need for an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire. France calls for de-escalation. We stand ready to contribute to this alongside our partners, and we will continue resolutely to support the legitimate resistance of Ukraine, which is fighting for its independence, its territorial integrity, and its sovereignty. Thank you.
感谢法国代表的发言。下面我请巴拿马代表发言。
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency of the Security Council for having agreed with the due urgency to the request to address in this meeting the events that supposedly took place. At the same time, we would like to thank Ms. Vanessa Fraser, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Ms. Edem Wasonu, Director of the Crisis Response Division at OCHA, and Mr. Ted Chaiban, the Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund, for the information that they have provided us with, and which is particularly important, above all in view of the scarce available evidence relating to the incident that brings us here today. We recognize the presence of the representative of Ukraine, who honors us with his presence. Barely 2 days ago, this council held an open debate on the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict. During that debate, many, if not all of us, expressed particular concern over the harm that conflicts cause to children. On that occasion, our delegation warned that while this council deliberates at each and every meeting 14 civilians lose their lives in armed conflicts, according to data from the United Nations. Regrettably, what took place in Luhansk, where it is reported that a drone attack at night against the dormitory of an educational facility took place, and this presents us once again with a painful reality. The available information perhaps does not allow us to fully know or verify the scale nor the total scope of the human consequences of this attack. But we cannot allow that the repetition of war and above all its repercussions against children, we cannot allow it to continue to erode our ability to feel anything, because the great risk of long drawn-out conflicts is not only physical destruction, it is also the moral normalization of suffering. Quite frankly, we have to ask ourselves, when did we start to accept that children could become collateral damage time and again in modern warfare? The most alarming thing is that attacks against schools, boarding schools, universities, and educational facilities no longer generate the same level of international shock that they once did. We have seen this happen in Gaza, in Sudan, Iran, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Syria. Schools bombed, children wounded, killed, or abducted, classrooms reduced to rubble. Panama has consistently condemned attacks against the civilian population, regardless of where they take place or who perpetrates them. We do so again today, faced with reports coming from Starobielsk, and we will always continue to do so, because international humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively, and the protection of civilians, above all the protection of children, cannot be conditioned by political, military, or strategic considerations. The attack that we are considering today requires our attention. Once again, it highlights a deeply alarming reality, one that was recently highlighted in the report of the Secretary General. State actors are those that are primarily responsible for a significant number of incidents affecting the civilian population and civilian infrastructure in armed conflicts. Schools, student residences, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure are spaces that should remain protected with a red line. Above all, they should be protected from destruction caused by increasingly sophisticated technological capacities such as drones, which must not become the scene of destruction, nor can they become targets in a war in which the civilian population continues to pay the highest price. Every attack of this nature, be it intentional or not, that is targeted at educational facilities and residences where children study, live, and sleep, any such attack leaves permanent consequences, lives cut short, irreparable physical wounds, and psychological trauma that will mark entire generations and which will affect communities for decades, and which also harm the continuity of the education of future citizens. This Council must not allow the noise of war to lead us to forget that protecting children must be the most basic and most sacred way that we defend our humanity. The scale of the war, the escalation of the war in Ukraine, the more than 4 years of conflict and its intensification, fed by the provision of arms and resources, are sufficient arguments to put an end to this conflict, beginning with an immediate, complete, and sustainable ceasefire. Now is the time to say, enough is enough. We call upon the parties to not turn civilians into the hostages of this war, above all in the case of children. It is only through dialogue that an agreement can be reached that will put an end to this war. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I thank OCHA Director Vosorno, SRG Frazier, and Deputy Executive Director Chaiban for their factual briefings. The war Russia started affects every inch of Ukrainian territory, from Lviv to occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, from Chernihiv to occupied Crimea. The UN can verify casualties and violations of international humanitarian law only in territories controlled by Ukraine, because the government of Ukraine provides full and unimpeded access. Russia denies any access to temporarily occupied territories. Hence, Russia operates only with its own claims, without verification and without independent media. Disinformation and lies are a well-worn tactic from the Kremlin's playbook, designed to advance Russia's imperialistic aspirations and threaten countries. Russia has been fabricating pretexts, stalling for time, deliberately undermining any genuine peace efforts. Latvia will only engage in facts, not allegations. Facts speak for themselves. UNICEF has verified that in Ukraine, Russian bombardments have killed or injured more than 3,200 children since the start of full-scale aggression in 2022. For 3 consecutive years, UN verified child casualties in Ukraine have increased. More than 1,700 schools and other education facilities have been damaged or destroyed. OHCHR has verified that at least 238 civilians were killed and 1,404 injured in Ukraine in April alone. In April, the Security Council held only 1 meeting on Ukraine. WHO has verified at least 2,881 attacks by Russia in Ukraine against healthcare, affecting health workers, facilities, ambulances, and medical warehouses. There are numerous UN investigative reports that detail widespread war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia and Ukraine. Let Russia and its allies remember, accountability for all atrocities committed is not optional. It doesn't have an expiration date. Latvia consistently has been calling on Russia to provide full and unimpeded access to occupied territories, and Russia itself, for UN agencies and international monitors. In every meeting, Latvia has stressed the dire situation in the occupied territories. In February, Latvia underscored again the forcibly transferred Ukrainian children and militarization of Ukrainian children in the occupied territories. In March, we drew the attention to the widespread torture against prisoners of war and civilian detainees taking place in Russia's detention facilities, including in the occupied territories. In April, we highlighted the ethnic, political, and religious persecution of Crimean Tatars, who make up the majority of the political prisoners in occupied Crimea. Last Tuesday, we raised the unacceptable situation in the occupied village of Oleshki, where due to Russian drone attacks and mined roads, civilians are trapped in the village with limited food supplies and no drinking water. Mr. President, it is outright cynical and shameful that Russia has called this meeting today. It is obvious that for Russia, international humanitarian law matters only when it fits its imperialistic goals. Only when Russia will fully cooperate with the UN system and independent monitors, there can be meaningful engagements. So far, there are only attacks on the UN system and independent monitors. Internet blackout imposed on its own population and repression of independent media. So my message is clear. Russia started this war in 2014, Russia can end it. Leave Luhansk, leave Donetsk, leave Sevastopol, leave Mariupol, and let the Ukrainian people live in peace as they did before. Unconditional ceasefire is the first step to achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the United States.
And thank you to our briefers today. We are following the reports of those killed and wounded in Luhansk overnight. Many questions concerning this attack remain outstanding. The United States again calls for Russia to allow humanitarian workers to access areas under its control. While we await answers to those questions, we underscore the need for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire as a means toward a durable, negotiated end to the war. This death and destruction must stop now. The United States once again calls on the Russian Federation and Ukraine to end the war, in which millions of people have suffered. We urge you to negotiate in good faith to end this violence, out of your duty to protect and preserve the lives of your citizens. The fact that I even have to note this highlights the obscene absurdity of our situation. As President Trump has clearly and succinctly stated, I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people. The United States remains committed to a diplomatic solution and will do whatever it can to bring the war to a durable end. Lastly, we reaffirm our support of our fellow Security Council members and take note of the letter circulated yesterday by Latvia. It is also worth reiterating, the United States fulfills our commitments to NATO. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers. We have seen the reports cited by the Russian Federation regarding an alleged drone hit in Starobilsk, Ukrainian territory currently under temporary Russian occupation. At this stage, as we have heard from the briefers, the incident has not been objectively or independently verified. And as Russia refuses to allow any independent verification, we may sadly never get this. The United Kingdom deplores any loss of civilian life or injury, particularly to children. As we and others have noted this week, we should condemn all civilian harm wherever it occurs, and we do. The protection of civilians is a core principle of international humanitarian law. In that context, we must also be clear that there would be no civilian deaths if Russia had not launched its illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As a direct result, Ukraine is subjected to daily sustained bombardment. Since Russia has brought us here today to focus on civilian casualties, let's do that. Today is the 22nd day of this month. In the 22 days so far, Russia has killed at least 170 Ukrainian civilians, including today, when Russian drones hit a residential area in the heart of Dnipro, injuring at least 20 people, including a 9-month-old girl and a 6-year-old boy who are still receiving care. Yesterday, when a Russian daytime attack hit 8 residential buildings, with the attacks injuring at least 19 people, including 3 children. And the day before that, when Russia launched attacks hitting residential buildings, killing at least 8 people and injuring 52 others across the country. And this all comes just days after Russia unleashed the most intense aerial bombardment, the most intense aerial assault of the war so far. In Kiev, Ukrainian authorities report that 24 people were killed and 47 injured, including children, when a residential building was struck in Kiev. I could go on. May is on track to surpass the record high number of civilian casualties that Russia inflicted upon Ukraine in April, as they continue to launch coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure. we should all be focused on preventing the loss of innocent lives. And the truth is that we would not be sitting here today if Russia had opted for diplomacy instead of aggression, in 2022 or at any point since then. Indeed, they continue to reject diplomacy. It was this delegation which, just days ago, egregiously threatened Latvia, another council member in this very chamber. If Russia truly wished to protect civilians, it would agree to the ceasefire. The ceasefire that Ukraine and the rest of the world has been calling for, or better yet, it would end this war outright. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to Colombia.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency meeting. I thank the Director of the Crisis Response Division of OCHA, Ms. Edem Osonu, the Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict, Ms. Vanessa Fraser, and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Ted Chaiban, for their detailed briefings. I also extend my greetings to the delegations participating in today's meeting. Colombia notes with great concern the recent escalation of this conflict and the reports of attacks that continue to affect the civilian population and civilian infrastructure, including educational facilities. In a week in which this Council and the membership have practically in unison reiterated the urgent need to strengthen our commitments to the protection of civilians, what we continue to see on the ground is deeply concerning. Colombia has been clear in its message. Attacks against civilians and civilian objects are unacceptable, wherever they may come from. Schools, universities, and places of learning must never become theaters of war. And the same goes for humanitarian facilities, hospitals, collection centers, or any other place that is essential for the civilian population. International humanitarian law is not optional, nor does it allow for selective application. It is a legal obligation enshrined in numerous international instruments and, furthermore, strengthened by the political commitments made by states. The parties must respect and uphold these obligations. Regrettably, today, the facts demonstrate that this appeal is not being heeded. Colombia expresses its profound concern over the escalation in the means and methods of war in this conflict, including the growing and incremental use of drones and their convergence with new technologies. The evolution of technology does nothing to change legal obligations. The use of these systems cannot come at the expense of the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. In a context in which there is already clear disrespect for international humanitarian law, the use of these technologies raises additional concerns, particularly when they can weaken the capacity to distinguish between military targets and the civilian population. Mr. President, Colombia reiterates that the priority must be peace. This conflict will find no solution in a greater escalation or in successive retaliations or the normalization of attacks that continue to claim civilian lives. There is an urgent need to resume dialogue, re-establish active, functional channels of communication that are focused on achieving concrete results and also making progress with confidence-building measures that make it possible to reduce the suffering and open up spaces, real spaces for de-escalation. Colombia reiterates its appeal for an immediate ceasefire, not a symbolic one, but a real one, as a first step towards stopping the violence and creating the conditions for moving towards a just and lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Mr. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is following with grave concern the continued deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine, as well as the continued expansion of the effects of this war on the civilian population, essential infrastructure, and the prospects for a peaceful settlement. My delegation would like to thank the briefers for their briefings, which once again recall the urgent need for a responsible mobilization on the part of this Council for the protection of civilians, for de-escalation, and to find a just, lasting, and credible peace. Mr. President, recent reports of a drone attack that hit a establishment housing minors and students in Starobelsk in the region of Luhansk are deeply concerning. 72 hours after our last intervention, the fears that we expressed on the subject of this drawn-out conflict and its repercussions for the civilian population have unfortunately been echoed in the tragedy that has just occurred. You will recall that my delegation drew the attention of this Council on Tuesday to the fact that recent developments in this conflict illustrated a dangerous trend, and this latest attack confirms that trend. The longer this war continues, the more fragile the line between the battlefield and the civilian space becomes, exposing the population to increasingly serious suffering. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to firmly recall that the protection of civilians in conflict remains a sacrosanct principle that cannot be contravened nor contextualized by any logic of war or any military consideration. No response can justify the fact that children and schools are attacked. The protection of civilians cannot be selective. It is incumbent upon all parties in all circumstances, in accordance with international law, international humanitarian law, and the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The Democratic Republic of the Congo recalls once again that there can be no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy represent the only paths towards a lasting settlement of this conflict, for the sake of the population that has suffered all too much. In this regard, my delegation invites all of the parties to exercise restraint and to pursue de-escalation, and this council, invite this council to encourage all mediation efforts that are being taken, including by partners. My delegation also recalls that rapid, safe, sustainable and unhindered humanitarian access must be guaranteed for all persons in need. Humanitarian personnel, medical workers, rescue workers, and infrastructure and relief and rescue infrastructure must be protected in all circumstances. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, in this regard, encourages all initiatives that could reduce tensions, preserve the channels of communication between the parties, and steadily rebuild trust. The recent prisoner exchanges demonstrate that dialogue remains possible, even in a context of profound confrontation. Mr. President, faced with the suffering of the civilian population, our collective responsibility cannot be one of indifference, of polarization, or of resignation. It must be that of restraint, of responsibility, and of the sincere pursuit of peace. The Democratic Republic of the Congo therefore calls upon the parties to set aside the logic of confrontation, to strictly comply with their international obligations, to spare the civilian population, and to, with determination, prioritize the path of diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. To conclude, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, respect for international law, and the need for a lasting peace rooted in the security of the populations, responsibility of the parties, and the restoration of confidence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the DRC for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers for their sobering briefings. As we convene today, my delegation remains deeply concerned by the reported recent development. The ongoing hostility serves only to prolong human suffering and further diminish the prospect for a sustainable peace. We are troubled by the continued escalation of military actions affecting civilian and civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly children, the most vulnerable, and the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international law. Our delegation reiterates that all parties must prioritize de-escalation and exercise utmost restraint. We remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable means to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, we urge the resumption of the international diplomatic initiatives, in particular the trilateral talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. These engagements continue to represent vital steps toward a comprehensive ceasefire, and we hope they will lay the ground for a constructive path to peace. A durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and be fully consistent with the United Nations Charter and the principles. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and a shared vision of common sustainable security. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving resolution that restores peace, security, and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I shall now make statement in my capacity as a representative of China. I thank Director Wosonu, SRSG Frazier, and Deputy Executive Director Chaiban for their briefings. China has noted the reported drone attack on a school in Starobelsk and expresses deep concerns over the resulting casualties, particularly those among students. China condemns any attacks targeting innocent civilians. A protracted Ukraine crisis, intensifying situations on the battlefield, and immense suffering of the people. These are the things that no party, including China, wishes to see. Lately, the parties launched a frequent and large-scale drone and missile attacks, subjecting more and more residential areas, schools, and civilian infrastructure to attacks. It is a very worrisome situation. We call on the parties to remain calm and exercise restraint, strictly observe international humanitarian law, effectively protect the safety of civilians, cease attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, promptly escalate the situation on the battlefield, and strive to bring hope for an early return to peace. The Ukraine issue is at a critical stage of dialogue and negotiations. In this context, what we need are goodwill instead of hatred, de-escalation instead of heightened tensions, and efforts towards the same goal instead of military confrontation. Although the momentum of negotiations has slowed down a little, and the major differences remain in the positions of the parties, if we can keep the talks going, we will see the dawn of peace. The relevant parties should redouble their efforts, demonstrate political will, show flexibility, take each other's legitimate security concerns seriously and address them properly, and aim to reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement at an early date. China's position on the Ukraine issue is objective, impartial, and consistent. Guided by the four shoes principle put forward by President Xi Jinping, we have always stood on the side of peace, dialogue, and humanity. We firmly support ending the conflict and reaching a political solution and have made extensive efforts to promote peace talks. Together with the international community, China stands ready to continue playing a constructive role for the political settlement of the crisis. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of this Council, before I proceed with my statement, I want to react to the invitation of Mr. Nebenzia. I'm not sure that I will have any appetite to visit Moscow. Even when Russia is defeated, even when and after Putin's regime has collapsed, even after Russia has paid war reparations, even when the next government in Russia were to beg on its knees for an apology, even after all the Russian war criminals will be sentenced, there will be no reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia for decades, maybe for centuries. I will even refuse to visit Moscow as a member of Ukraine delegation that will travel to Russia to witness Russia's signature of its declaration of capitulation. Mr. President, unlike on other occasions, I will refrain today from thanking the Presidency, and I will not extend the customary words of appreciation for the convening of this emergency meeting, as neither the facts nor the circumstances provide any legitimate justification for placing this matter before the Security Council this afternoon. What we have been witnessing over recent months, both at the previous meetings of this Council and today, is a shameless attempt by the Russian Federation to turn reality upside down and to present itself here as a victim. This recurring exercise in political theater staged by Russia in this chamber is not only entirely predictable, but also profoundly disrespectful to the members of this Council. The rationale behind this shameless performance, orchestrated once again by the Russian delegation in this distinguished hall, is as self-evident as the contempt it demonstrates towards its Council. The Ukrainian delegation wishes to express its profound concern that Russia, having appropriated the permanent seat of the former Soviet Union at the Security Council, under legally questionable and dubious circumstances, continues to exploit this unmerited privilege with growing cynicism and complete disregard for this Council. It is truly alarming and disturbing that Russia, which hijacked this seat without any proper legal procedure, keeps abusing this privilege relentlessly and without the slightest sense of restraint or responsibility, in a manner unworthy of a permanent member of the Security Council entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Sitting on the Council does not give Russia a license to spread lies and disseminate propaganda. If we would follow this logic, then Ukraine would be going to request emergency meetings of this Council every single day. If you, distinguished members of the Council, are ready to meet 5 times a week to address Russian atrocities against Ukrainian civilians, so is our delegation. Mr. President, just 3 days ago, we met in this chamber to address Russia's escalation of its war of aggression against Ukraine and witnessed new horrified reports about growing numbers of civilian casualties in Ukraine and Russia's barbaric war crimes. During this week, the brutality of Russian atrocities, as we just heard also from the distinguished briefers, against the civilian population only increased dramatically. 478 attack drones and ballistic missiles were launched against Ukraine in the last 3 days only. As a result of these strikes, 3 civilians were murdered and over 30 people were seriously injured. On May 20th, Russia struck the city of Konotop in the Sumy region with drones killing 1 person and injuring 11 civilians. A multi-story residential building was hit with floors from the 2nd to the 4th destroyed. On the same day, a missile struck, as we just heard from the report, of Ms. Vosornu, a warehouse in Dnipro used by UNHCR, killing at least 2 people while destroying 900 pallets of humanitarian aid and shelter materials valued at over $1 million. It was the first attack by Russian armed forces on a UNHCR facility since the start of the full-scale invasion. Also, on the 20th of May, Russia shelled the city of Vilnyansk in the Zaporizhia region, hitting a private house and seriously injuring 4 civilians, including 2 children, a 2-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. Just yesterday, Russian troops attacked the city of Dnipro again, damaging residential high-rise buildings and injuring 19 people, including children, a 6-year-old boy, a 9-month-old girl, and a 13-year-old boy. The same day, Russian forces shelled Sumy using long-range artillery, with strikes recorded at 5 locations in the Kovpakivsky district. 3 people were hospitalized, including a 13-year-old boy. Today, Russia continued its attack across Ukraine, launching 124 drones overnight. While most were intercepted, several strikes hit multiple locations, causing casualties. Mr. President, let me repeat, all these numerous war crimes were committed by Russia just within the last 3 days. What is important to know is that all those facts regarding Russian crimes in and against Ukraine are not just well documented by our national investigative authorities, but also verified by independent international monitoring mechanisms. In particular, since 2014, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has been operating with full capacity to collect objective information and establish facts regarding Russia's systematic violations of international humanitarian law. Detailed reports on Russia's crimes in Ukraine, including deliberate attacks and killings of civilians, are regularly published by this UN mission, as well as by the Independent International Commission on Inquiry in Ukraine, the OSCE Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and relevant Council of Europe monitoring bodies. Ukraine has nothing to conceal and fully cooperates with all these independent institutions. Mr. President, and now let us turn to the absurd accusations of the Russian representative regarding an alleged incident in Starobilsk that we just heard today. Russia has consistently denied, and we just heard this, they denied access to the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine since 2014 for all international monitoring mechanisms. There is no independent verification of all these baseless claims, as once again was confirmed by our distinguished briefers. So everything we hear today about Starobilsk is a pure propaganda show, nothing else. Such false accusations belong to a textbook disinformation campaign from Moscow designed to deflect from its own war crimes and manipulate international public opinion. These groundless allegations fit a well-documented pattern of Russian disinformation operations aimed at distorting reality, creating confusion, and evading responsibility. To establish the truth about what is happening in Starobilsk, as well as in other occupied towns and villages of Ukraine, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Crimea, all these territories must be liberated from Russian occupation, and they will be liberated. Mr. President, Ukraine again categorically refutes all false accusations regarding this incident in Starobilsk. Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter to protect its people and liberate its own land from foreign occupation. Let me remind this Council, the Ukrainian city of Starobilsk was brutally occupied on the 3rd of March 2022 by the Russian armed forces. Now, according to reports that we have, only 20% of its citizens remained in this occupied city. And the truth is that the Russian army has been using civilian facilities like drone operations unit who have been hunting civilians in Ukraine like a human safari since then, all the time. And it's also something that you have to remember speaking about this alleged incident. I would like to reiterate once again that Ukraine's defense forces operate under strict democratic oversight. They act in absolute compliance with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Ukraine only targets legitimate military targets and facilities used for military purposes. Our armed forces take every precaution to minimize collateral damage, unlike Russia's forces. The operations on the night of May 22 exclusively targeted the Russian war machine. The strikes successfully neutralized an oil refinery which was fueling occupation forces, ammunition depots, air defense assets, and also command centers. Mr. President, the hypocrisy of Russia's Federation knows no limits. The Russian representative routinely uses mirror propaganda, accusing Ukraine of the exact war crimes that Moscow commits daily. Russian troops continue to deliberately target Ukrainian cities as we speak, energy grids and residential areas, while Ukraine surgically dismantles the military infrastructure enabling those attacks. Mr. President, I would pose what is perhaps a rhetoric question to this chamber. For how much longer will the members of the Security Council, those who rightfully serve here, either by virtue of the UN Charter or by the trust vested in them by the General Assembly, continue to tolerate this cynical instrumentalization by Russia, this undisguised mockery at the hands of the Russian self-appointed impostors seated among us? One may look into history for guidance, and one finds there is a rather instructive parallel. Russia's claim to the permanent seat of the former Soviet Union bears resemblance to one phenomenon of the so-called Lzhe-Dmitry, false Dmitry, a pretender who briefly occupied the throne in Moscow under a borrowed legitimacy. For those who are less familiar with Russian history, Lzhe-Dmitry, or false Dmitry, was an impostor who claimed to be Tsarevich Dmitry, the younger son of Ivan Grozny, Tsar Ivan the Terrible. On that false claim of identity, he managed to seize the throne in Moscow in 1605, only to hold it for less than a year before his deception was exposed and his rule collapsed. In that sense, one might describe today's Russian Federation, without excessive embellishment and not without irony, as a kind of UN collective false Dmitry. Россия — это ООНовский Лжедмитрий.
Russia is the UN false Dmitry.
Permanent seat of this council, not through the established UN Charter procedures, but through manipulation and sleight-of-hand tactics. We are fully aware that it will not be easy to correct this fateful error of modern history and deprive the Russian Federation of its permanent seat of the Security Council that it hijacked through highly questionable means. But this decision is inevitable. It is just a matter of time. Mr. President, Russia is losing its aggressive war against Ukraine, not just in the battlefield. Russian troops have reached a breaking point. What we observe is a diplomatic defeat of Russia also here at the United Nations. It appears nervous, displaying visible signs of desperation. The very convening of this meeting is such a sign of weakness and an attempt to turn the tide and to squeeze a tear out of this council. Allow me, therefore, to conclude with a suggestion for my Russian colleague regarding his official report on today's meeting to Mr. Lavrov and perhaps also in copy to Mr. Putin. As you may anticipate, I will formulate it in a language that they are unlikely to misunderstand. So your telegram to Moscow, Mr. Nebenzia, shall be very brief. Шеф, все пропало.
All is lost.
I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked the floor for a further statement. I give him the floor.
Mr. President, I am very pleased at the knowledge of the Ukrainian permanent representative about Russian history, but with your permission, I will not enter into a dialogue with him because this is a pointless and there's a useless initiative. I would like to talk about something else. Frankly speaking, it is somewhat awkward, and I'm a little bit ashamed for certain members, colleagues of the Security Council. We knew that we would hear what we would hear from European members of the Security Council, something similar, but today their cynicism has reached staggeringly high levels. Not a single one of them deigned to even mention the dead children in Starobelsk. The representative of Denmark stated that that apparently that there's no access to them. Do you need access to rubble? Or perhaps you will allege that Russia itself did that, or these are computer-based graphics. You allege that there's no independent corroboration of this not being staged, but even the headquarters of the Ukrainian armed forces have confirmed that they struck Starobilsk. This is not even hypocrisy, not even double standards. This is a blatant mockery of child victims. We stated in we said in our statement that there are victims for you who warrant grief and those who do not warrant it. Hearing you, I'm talking about those present, the members of the European Union, those who are absent, is a mockery, a defamation of the feelings of those who suffered, irrespective on which side. How did we reach this point? European representatives do not view children, the young students of Starobilsk, the residents of Donbass, and the people in Russia as people. This does not dehumanize them. This dehumanizes you, those of you who are seated here making such statements. Are you really not ashamed of making such statements, saying what we hear today? This is a form of the dance on the bones of those who have perished. This is disgusting to me. I would have genuinely been sorry for you had it not been for your vile cynicism and mockery of the memory of the dead. Thank you.
I note that the representative of Denmark has asked for the floor. You have the floor.
To prolong this on a Friday afternoon, but I feel compelled to respond to the remarks by the representative of the Russian Federation. Unlike what was predicted by the representative of the Russian Federation before we all spoke today, where we were lectured about the kind of double standards we would show this afternoon, I would just repeat what I said in my statement. Throughout this war, Denmark has consistently deplored attacks on civilians and demanded full respect of international humanitarian law without exceptions. There must be full accountability and justice for all crimes committed in the senseless war of choice launched by Russia. This, of course, includes any kind of killing or maiming of children, which we have repeatedly said in this chamber. So no, we do not feel shame. And actually, yes, we would like to have access, because this is exactly what we demand in any situation in this chamber. We would like to have independent verification so we know what we're talking about. It has not been possible in this hour. So thank you very much.
现在发言名单上
There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.